So his body the size of a bus collapses into the mud, and before the ground even settles, something else is already there. Not charging, not roaring, not announcing itself like a king, just waiting, watching, measuring. The kind of predator that doesn't rely on size alone, but on timing, pressure, and the smallest mistake. That's where the real question begins to take shape. Because if power alone defined the deadliest hunter to ever walk the earth, the answer would be simple. But it isn't. And once you start looking closer, the shadow cast by the Tyrannosaurus rex doesn't feel as absolute as it once did. The image most people carry is almost theatrical. A towering animal, jaws wide enough to crush bone, footsteps that shake the ground, a presence that dominates everything around it. And none of that is wrong. T-Rex was enormous, built like a machine that didn't need refinement, because brute force alone could end most encounters before they even started. But evolution rarely settles for just one solution. It experiments constantly across millions of years in environments that don't reward size as much as they reward efficiency, adaptability, and precision. Long before T-Rex appeared, the world had already seen generations of hunters rise and disappear. Entire ecosystems shaped by creatures that filled similar roles, each one slightly different, each one tuned to the conditions of its time. The late Cretaceous, where T-Rex lived, was just one chapter. Not the beginning, not even the longest. Just one moment where certain traits aligned in a way that made that animal incredibly effective. But effectiveness isn't always about being the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it's about energy. How much you spend versus how much you gain. A predator that wastes less, risks less, and succeeds more consistently can outcompete something far more powerful. That's where things start to shift. Imagine a different kind of hunter. Smaller, faster, working in groups or relying on agility rather than impact. Not trying to overpower everything, but selecting targets carefully, isolating weaknesses, striking where it matters. In some environments, that approach doesn't just compete with brute force, it outperforms it. And the fossil record, incomplete as it is, hints at these alternatives constantly. Tracks preserved in ancient sediment, showing coordinated movement. Bite marks that suggest repeated attacks rather than a single crushing blow. Bone beds where patterns don't quite match the behavior of a solitary giant. Even within the world of large predators, T-Rex wasn't alone. It shared the earth with other carnivores that approached hunting differently. Some had longer arms, built for grasping and holding. Others had skulls shaped for slicing rather than crushing. Each design tells a story about how that animal interacted with its environment, what it hunted, and how it survived. The idea of a perfect predator starts to fall apart once you see how many different versions of success existed at the same time. Nature doesn't aim for perfection. It builds what works in that moment, in that place, under those conditions. And then there's the question that quietly sits underneath everything. What does more lethal actually mean? Is it the ability to kill the largest prey, the frequency of successful hunts, the efficiency of energy use, the ability to survive injuries and keep hunting? Because when you start measuring those things instead of just size, the hierarchy begins to change. T-Rex had an extraordinary bite force, capable of crushing bone in a way few animals ever have. That alone gave it access to food sources others couldn't fully exploit. It didn't need to be delicate. It didn't need multiple attempts. One well-placed bite could end an encounter quickly. But that same body came with costs. Massive weight means slower acceleration. Larger energy requirements mean greater risk if hunts fail. An injury, even a minor one, carries more consequences when your entire survival depends on maintaining that level of dominance. Now shift your attention to predators that operated differently. Creatures that may not have been able to take down the largest herbivores alone, but didn't need to. They hunted smaller targets, more frequently with less risk. Their survival wasn't tied to a single high-stakes encounter, but to a series of smaller, more manageable ones. In a way, that's a different kind of lethality. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but consistent. And consistency, over millions of years, can matter more than raw power. There's also the environment itself. Late Cretaceous North America wasn't an open battlefield. It was dense, humid, filled with vegetation, rivers, and shifting terrain. Visibility wasn't always clear, movement wasn't always easy. In that kind of setting, speed and maneuverability could be just as important as strength. A massive predator still had advantages, no question, but it also had limitations. Turning radius, acceleration, the ability to navigate dense vegetation, these are factors that don't show up in dramatic reconstructions, but they shape real behavior. And then there's the prey. Animals like Triceratops weren't passive targets. They were heavily built, armed, capable of defending themselves. A direct confrontation carried real risk, even for something as powerful as T-Rex. Every hunt had consequences, and not all of them ended cleanly. So the idea that one predator stood above all others starts to feel less certain. It becomes less about dominance in a cinematic sense and more about survival across time. And somewhere in that uncertainty, the possibility opens up that there were predators, maybe smaller, maybe less famous, that were just as effective or even more so in ways that aren't immediately obvious, because the fossil record doesn't preserve success the way we imagine it. It preserves bones, fragments, moments frozen by chance. What it doesn't always show is how often a predator succeeded, how efficiently it lived, or how many generations it sustained. And that leaves space for a different kind of answer. One that isn't as straightforward as pointing to the biggest skull or the strongest bite. The story isn't about replacing T-Rex as the most iconic predator. It's about questioning whether icon status actually reflects the full picture of what it means to be lethal. And once that question is asked, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because somewhere in the deep past, under conditions very different from the ones we usually imagine, there may have been hunters that didn't need to be the largest to be the most dangerous. Take a closer look at how a hunt actually unfolds, not in dramatic bursts, but in the quiet build-up before anything happens. A predator doesn't just appear and attack. It spends time reading the environment, noticing patterns, waiting for imbalance. That process doesn't always favor the biggest animal in the room. In many cases, it favors the one that can stay unnoticed the longest, move with the least resistance, and commit at exactly the right moment. There are fossil clues that suggest some theropods may have relied more on speed and coordination than raw force. Trackways that run parallel for stretches before converging. Not definitive proof of pack hunting, but enough to raise questions. Enough to suggest that behavior, not just anatomy, played a role in survival strategies. If a predator can rely on others of its kind, the entire equation changes. Risk spreads out. One individual doesn't have to take the full impact of a defensive strike. Exhaustion becomes less of a problem when effort is shared. Prey that would be impossible for a single hunter becomes manageable through coordination. Now imagine applying that to a landscape where prey animals move in groups, constantly alert, reacting to the smallest disturbance. A solitary giant might rely on ambush and power, but a coordinated group could manipulate movement, isolate individuals, and force mistakes over time. That doesn't make one approach superior in every situation, but it does highlight something important. Lethality isn't a single trait. It's a combination of behaviors, physical capabilities, and environmental awareness. Even within T-Rex itself, there are signs that its life wasn't a series of effortless victories. Fossilized injuries tell a different story. Healed fractures, bite marks from other large predators, infections that the animal survived long enough to recover from. These weren't rare occurrences. They were part of life at the top of the food chain. Every scar suggests a moment where things didn't go perfectly. A hunt that turned dangerous, a confrontation that escalated. Survival wasn't guaranteed even for something that powerful, and that brings up another angle that often gets overlooked. Longevity. A predator that lives longer, hunts more often, and avoids catastrophic injuries contributes more to its lineage than one that relies on high-risk encounters, even if it wins most of them. So a smaller, more cautious predator that consistently avoids damage might, in evolutionary terms, be just as successful as a larger one that dominates but takes greater risks. There's also metabolism to consider. The energy demands of a massive body are enormous. Every day requires a significant intake of food just to maintain basic function. If prey becomes scarce or conditions shift, that requirement becomes a liability. A smaller predator doesn't face the same pressure. It can survive on less, adapt more easily to changes in prey availability, and recover more quickly from periods of scarcity. These differences don't show up in a skeleton, they don't leave obvious marks in the fossil record, but they shape survival in fundamental ways. And then there are predators that existed outside the typical dinosaur narrative entirely. Creatures that hunted in water, in the air, or at the boundaries between ecosystems. Some of them developed strategies that bypass the limitations of land-based hunting altogether. A predator that attacks from below, using the cover of water, doesn't need to chase. One that strikes from above relies on gravity as much as muscle. These approaches reduce energy expenditure while increasing success rates. When you compare those strategies to a terrestrial hunter, the definition of lethal stretches even further. It becomes less about physical dominance and more about control over the moment of attack. Even among land predators, specialization created different paths. Some focused on speed, others on endurance. Some evolved slicing teeth for repeated attacks, others crushing jaws for a single decisive blow. Each method worked within its own context. So where does that leave the question? If the goal is to identify the most powerful bite, T-Rex stands near the top. If the goal is to identify the most iconic predator, it probably holds that position without much competition. But if the goal shifts to something less visible, efficiency, consistency, adaptability, the answer becomes harder to pin down. There may not be a single predator that clearly surpasses T-Rex in every category, but there are likely many that matched or exceeded it in specific ways that matter just as much. And that's where the idea starts to shift from comparison to perspective. Instead of asking whether something was more lethal in a general sense, it becomes more useful to ask how different predators achieved lethality in their own environments. Because in a dense forest, the fastest hunter might dominate. In open terrain, endurance could matter more. Near water, ambush becomes the defining trait. Each environment selects for different strengths, and over millions of years, those strengths become refined into entirely different kinds of predators. T-Rex represents one of those outcomes, a very successful one, shaped by the specific conditions of late Cretaceous North America. But it wasn't the only answer evolution produced, and it definitely wasn't the final one. There's something almost misleading about how clearly we can picture T-Rex today. Museums display near-complete skeletons, digital models fill in the gaps, documentaries animate every movement with confidence. It creates the impression that we fully understand how this animal lived, hunted, and interacted with its world. But that clarity is partly constructed, built from fragments, comparisons, and educated assumptions. Even the most complete specimens are still missing pieces. Reconstruction fills those spaces, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Over time, these reconstructions become the default image, repeated so often that they feel unquestionable. But when you step back, the uncertainties start to show again. How often did T-Rex hunt versus scavenge? How did it choose its targets? Did it avoid certain prey entirely? These questions don't have final answers. They're built on interpretations that can shift with new discoveries. And if our understanding of such a well-known predator still has gaps, imagine how much we might be missing about less famous ones. There could be entire behaviors that left no trace, hunting strategies that didn't fossilize, interactions that disappeared without record. The absence of evidence doesn't mean absence of complexity. So when asking whether something more lethal existed, there's an unavoidable layer of uncertainty. The fossil record isn't a complete archive. It's a partial one shaped by chance. What we do know is that evolution doesn't stop experimenting. It doesn't settle on a single design and declare it the best. It keeps producing variations, each one testing a slightly different approach to survival. Some of those approaches are subtle, less dramatic, less likely to capture attention, but that doesn't make them less effective. In fact, it often means the opposite. Because the predators that rely on spectacle, on overwhelming force, are easier to imagine, easier to reconstruct, easier to recognize. The ones that rely on nuance tend to disappear into the background, both in life and in history. And yet those quieter strategies may have been just as successful, if not more so, over long periods of time. That doesn't diminish T-Rex. If anything, it places it in a more interesting context, not as the unquestioned peak, but as one of many highly specialized outcomes in a long chain of evolutionary experiments. A snapshot of what worked under very specific conditions. And maybe that's the real answer, hiding behind the original question. Not that there was a single predator more lethal than T-Rex in every possible way, but that lethality itself isn't a fixed concept. It shifts depending on what you value: power, efficiency, adaptability, survival rate. Change the definition and the ranking changes with it. Somewhere out there in layers of rock not yet uncovered, there may be evidence of predators that challenge our current assumptions even further. Or maybe the most effective hunters were never preserved well enough for us to recognize them. Either way, the story isn't finished, and that's part of what makes it worth paying attention to. If you've made it this far, there's something I'd actually like to hear from you. Not just a quick comment, but your take on this idea. When you picture the deadliest predator, what comes to mind first? Size, intelligence, strategy, or something else entirely? I read those thoughts, and they shape what gets explored next here more than you might expect. And if you've ever had a moment, watching a documentary, visiting a museum, or even just reading something that completely changed how you see these animals, share that too. Those shifts in perspective are where the most interesting conversations start. If this kind of approach to these topics feels different in a good way, staying around is simple. No pressure, just an open invitation to be part of it as more of these questions get pulled apart and rebuilt from new angles. And if you decide to subscribe, do it like you mean it. Not out of habit, but because you're actually curious about what comes next here.